Shalom, this is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Maimi Jewish Federation. This week I saw a film on the Apollo 8 mission to the moon. In 1968, this was the first mission to reach the moon and orbit it. Bill Anders, Frank Borman, and Jim Lovell were asked on Christmas Eve to address the American people. Here they were, the first human beings ever to orbit the moon, to get anywhere near it. In seeing the entirety of the planet, which was a small ball emerging over the lunar landscape, I have to imagine in these moments they were gazing upon all of human history itself. Any episode of any importance, joys, tragedy, every conversation, every cry, every memory, every war, every peace treaty, everything. All of history happened on this small little globe that they could see between their two fingers. What does one say? What words could really express what they were feeling? Well, they decided to say the following words. Bill Anders opened, "We are now approaching the lunar sunrise, and for all of the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send you this morning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw the light. It was good. And God divided the light from the darkness." This week's Parashat, Masei, Matot Masei, opens with the travels of the Jewish people for over 40 years. They record 42 stops of the Jewish people throughout the desert over those 40 years. Now the question all the commentaries ask, do we really need to know exactly where they went? It seems rather long-winded and repetitive. Why do we care? Okay, they were in the desert for 40 years. Within the 42 years in the desert, they moved 42 times. And the reason, of course, for their moving so much over such a course of a long time was because they sinned with the sin of the spies. A journey that was supposed to take a few weeks actually took over 40 years. Not one person that left Egypt, save Joshua and Caleb, actually made it to the land of Israel. 40 years is an awful long time to be journeying in the desert. Why do we even mention these stories of where they went and where they stopped? So Rashi brings an interesting midrash. He says it could be compared to the case of a king whose son becomes ill, and the king sends his son to a distant place to cure him. When they return home, the father begins to enumerate all of the stages of their journey together, saying to his son, here in this place we slept together. Here you caught cold. Here you had a headache, etc., etc. In this long journey of a child recovering from an illness, the father recounts every step. Every step of that journey had importance in his memory, and yet they made it. The son recovers. Rashi is directing us to the fact that this long journey of 40 years was a long journey in the desert, a time of vulnerability. The desert is not a place that easily yields its goods. We knew that they needed to be sustained by miracles. Traveling in the desert is a very hard thing, and the journeying in the desert is not forgiving. It's not only physically challenging, but also emotionally challenging. There are many steps forward in the desert experience, but there are also many steps backwards. Indeed, each of the places enumerated, many of them are associated with a lot of memory for those people about to go into the land of Israel. And not all of them very good, some of them quite tragic, in fact. Yet, after the end of 40 years, here they are at the border of the land of Israel. They're about to enter the land of Israel under Joshua's leadership. The journey, according to Rashi, is recorded to teach us Chazdei Hashem, to teach us the ultimate kindness of God. At each stop, I don't think people who are traveling through the desert for 40 years could realize the kindness of God. On the other hand, I think that they would have felt very angry, sometimes very lost, wandering in the desert. Only at the end, when we see the entire journey, do we get a sense that actually in this wandering, the people were actually moving towards a promised land. Thus, God tells Moses to write down each of the stops on this journey so people can remember the long journey to the land of Israel. It's interesting that in the record of each of the stops, there are two words that are used, Vayisu, Vayachanu. The first word, Vayisu, means that they began to journey. They uprooted themselves. They were in transition. The second word, Vayachanu, they encamped, is the idea to come to rest, to settle. These two moments of Vayisu, Vayachanu, to uproot and to journey and to settle oneself, is not just a physical journey for these people, but it's also an emotional journey. Rav Amital, of blessed memory, the rabbi of the Gush Etzion Yeshiva, said that the reason of each step of resting is to integrate whatever lessons were learned on the journey. Sometimes the lessons were difficult, and sometimes it takes a lifetime to understand the lessons. The people grew as they went to the promised land, but it took quite a long time, and sometimes beyond one lifetime. In fact, the Malbim, a 19th century commentator, says, when they left, how did they know they were supposed to journey? Because the cloud would rise over the tabernacle and start moving, and the people would follow. But they had no idea where they were going. They just had to follow a cloud through the desert to an uncertain destination. Rav Amital quotes the verse, Min ha-meitzar karataya anani v'merchavya, which means, from the narrows I call out to God, answer me with expanses. He notices that the word should not be ba-merchavya, answer me in expanses, but from the narrows I call, lead me to la-merchavya, to expanded places. But really, he says, the real journey of life is not just the physical journeys externally, but the internal journeys of the heart. When there are difficult times, we ask God to give us understanding, to give us that expansiveness within our hearts during those difficult times. This movement of movement and then rest to reflect and to understand is the movement of our week. For 6 days of the week, we are moving. But yet comes Shabbat, the same word is used, Shabbat Minucha, the Shabbat of rest, but it also means the Shabbat of encampment. We find our footing again, we understand where we are and where we've come, and hopefully we contemplate where we are going. So this emotional movement, journeying and then resting, is so important for our own lives. Being in the middle of a journey, especially in a difficult journey like the desert, is very hard. We can lose all sense of perspective. And I think right now, many of us in Miami, whether we're directly affected by the events at Surfside or we're impacted as a community, we are in that period of journeying. We are uprooted and we are journeying through the desert. It's hard to see any perspective or any sense of meaning in any kind of event, especially such a tragedy as this. The past few weeks really does feel like we've been uprooted. We felt we were settled, but then all of a sudden, in an instant, the entire community, we've had to move. We have fear and uncertainty. We do not know where we are going. We have no idea. We only know where we have come up to here. It's during times like these, like God who takes stock of every step of our journey, we need to look at our own journeys in our lives in the past, and what lessons do we learn up to now, and how can those lessons help us move forward, and where do we want to go? It's not going to be easy and not going to be immediate. We come back to our astronaut. The astronaut's watching the lunar sunrise with the Earth rising above the horizon of the moon. He must have felt at that moment the wings of eternity. At that moment, looking from the moon at 250,000 miles from home, it seems like a narrative took place. It was a story of light and darkness, of form and void, and ultimately the determination that this world is good. That realization doesn't always happen down here. The chaotic world in which we live seems to be sometimes purposeless. But from up there, they quote the opening story from Genesis, and God said it was good. For a moment, perhaps the astronauts saw what God sees. And God ultimately says that the story that we exist, the story of our lives, ultimately is good. May all of us, especially now, be given moments of grace where we can feel the moment of that moment in our own lives, especially during challenging times in the desert. Wishing all of you Shabbat Shalom.